Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our Lunch and Learn today. I see lots of familiar faces in the crowd, so that's always good. I'm Lisa Carrick. I'm a senior manager in the audit department, and I do work in our ERISA focus group. Today I'm here to present Rick Unser from Lockton Retirement Services. He's going to be covering his presentation, Concerned about 401k litigation, avoid these 5 mistakes. Rick has done our annual fiduciary training for a good number of years now. It's always well attended, and I know many of you in the room are fiduciaries, so we do appreciate that you come and attend this. We think it's best practice that you do have basic training on this topic. Rick is a workplace retirement plan consultant, and he works with companies and plan committees to help streamline plan processes and enhance fiduciary protection and improve employee retirement outcomes. And he also is the host of a podcast, 401k Fridays, which I listen to because I spend a lot of time in the car. It's a good one. It's a good listen. So please join me in welcoming Rick.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Can everybody hear me okay on the volume? All right. Good things. Well, thank you guys. So this hopefully will be a fun conversation today. As Lisa mentioned, I do host this crazy podcast called 401k Fridays. Before we get started, one of the main reasons that we're going to talk about this today is when we talk to folks, one of the number one concerns we hear from a fiduciary standpoint is, man, can somebody help me stay out of 401k jail or 403b jail, whatever type of retirement plan jail you want to stay out of. So what we'll kind of run through today is a little bit about why are some companies getting sued? What are some of the common themes, or what are some of the common reasons that that's actually happening? And then we'll also talk through some things that you can maybe think about or that you can do that will help you avoid lawsuits. Certainly, full disclosure, anyone can be sued at any reason for any time, at any time for any reason. But there are some common things that I think a lot of people have said are good things that you can do proactively or prospectively to avoid 401k lawsuits, or help you avoid 401k lawsuits. So first thing, anybody know who this is? It's not Santa Claus without a beard. All right, so this is a guy by the name of Jerry Schlichter. You guys might have seen some headlines that he is basically the guy about a decade ago that transformed the scope of ERISA litigation, 401k litigation, 403b litigation, whatever the case may be. Up until Jerry came onto the scene, really what was going on in the litigation space was people were going after providers. They were going after the people, the record keepers, the different people that were providing services to employers. They weren't really going after employers. They were having a real hard time figuring out how to crack that nut. So basically, Jerry, about 10 years ago, came up with this whole concept of fee litigation. And that's really where this current last decade of litigation that we have stemmed from, were some of the early cases that he brought. He was basically, I've talked to him a few times on the podcast I do, and he's the first one to tell you that the first several cases that he brought, he was basically laughed at by the defense bar, said this was never going to work, there was no chance, this was a road to nowhere for him and his plaintiff clients. But 10 years later, with a bunch of cases, he's secured over $300 million of settlements from employers. He's certainly one of the largest, the most active in the plaintiff litigation around 401ks. There are several other firms that now have kind of taken the formula that Jerry has put together, and Jerry and his firm have put together, and are, I don't want to call them copycats, but have basically used a lot of the formula and data points that he's kind of followed over the years to create now what we have, which is a lot of cases out there where employers are subject to ERISA litigation. Okay, there we go. So why are employers being sued? Most of the lawsuits fall into these 3 categories. So inappropriate investment choices, excessive fees, and self-dealing. So you can see over here, this looks at the number of cases. So, 2006, 2007, this is kind of when Jerry was getting started. Then we had sort of an explosion of cases, a little bit tapering off, and then they've ramped up over the last couple of years as we've seen more employers as we've seen more plaintiffs firms get into the mix. Now, over here, what you've got is an idea of where some of these cases are coming from. So inappropriate investment choices, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. That's mostly what you're seeing here. Excessive fees, that's the next one in red, and then self-dealing in black. So that's really from a number and from a category. This is why employers are being sued. Now, I think a couple things to understand about inappropriate investment choices. What we hear from a lot of employers that they're concerned about or are afraid of in these litigation cases is, we selected this large cap growth fund and there's a better large cap growth fund, and oh my gosh, if we don't remove it in a timely fashion, or if we don't get it off our menu in the right way, then we're going to get sued over the performance of that fund. Well, yes, that's possible, but really what most of these cases are coming from is you're using the wrong share class. You're using an actively managed fund instead of a passively managed fund, in their opinion. It's not necessarily that you chose the ABC fund and the XYZ fund performed 50 basis points better. It's no, you chose the ABC growth fund, which is an actively managed fund, and we're going to sue you because you should have chosen the passively managed fund. And what we're going to claim as your difference is the amount of cost between the two. So you could have gotten a passively managed fund for 5 basis points. Your actively managed growth fund was 95 basis points. We're now going to sue you for that difference of 85 basis points. Multiply that over the millions of dollars that you had in that fund or that plan, and multiply that over 6 years, which is the statute of limitations. That becomes your lawsuit. That becomes the damages that they're trying to recover. So a lot of this all ties together. The other thing, and this is where you'll see this a little more prominently, or it's actually kind of in the beginning, a lot of the early cases as well that Jerry brought, these aren't really coming out as much now, were self-dealing. One of the big cases that's still kind of working its way through the system is a case against ABB. And that was really, one of the first ones brought. But basically what they had is they took their 401k plan and they loaded it up with fees so that they didn't have to pay anything as a company to administer their deferred compensation plan. And they also, I believe, had a lot of their payroll costs were embedded in the 401k. So from a company standpoint, hey, we're going to save a bunch of money. But from a 401k outcomes perspective, obviously now you've passed on all this cost to your employees, to your participants, for a plan that maybe they might not even be getting a benefit from, and certainly for things that they shouldn't be paying for within the confines of their 401k plan. Okay, so let's start with mistakes, and we'll start with an easy one. Hopefully this isn't what people look like after I'm done here and turn it over to Lisa. But one of the funny things you'll hear Jerry say is that in some of the litigation or in some of the notes or the meeting minutes or just conversations with plan sponsors, he has a profound opinion that plan sponsors are just not paying attention. Employers are just not paying attention to their retirement plans. So you'll hear him talk about, well, they hold these meetings on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock and they just want to get out the door as quickly as they can to get started on their weekends. And, they're really not paying attention to what they should be in their retirement plan. The other thing, and on a little bit more serious note, is there's also a lot of confusion out there about what your fiduciary responsibilities really are. And maybe one thing I think people have had kind of beaten into their head over the last several years is, well, we need to review our plan investments. All right, well, that's certainly part of being a fiduciary. But really, these are kind of the 6 main duties as spelled out by the Department of Labor that you need to be focusing on or you need to understand as part of those fiduciary responsibilities. The first 2, I think, are the most important, and not that the others aren't, but I think they really guide the conversation. Number 1 is to act solely in the interest of your participants, or the exclusive purpose rule. So any decisions that you're making in your retirement plan, you really need to make those in the best interest of your employees, the best interest of the people that are participating in your plan, not what's in the best interest of the company. So that's where some people early on got themselves into trouble with the lawsuits. That's where this whole idea of self-dealing comes in, or conflicts of interest with the company, where you clearly made a decision that benefited you as the employer, and you either harmed or you didn't consider the impact, or were not concerned about the impact that decision had on your employees. So one of the things that we'll always say, and you'll hear Jerry say, or you'll hear a lot of the plaintiffs' firms say, is, hey, show us how this decision was in the best interest of your plan participants. And over the last several years, that's one of the things that we've really been encouraging our clients to add into their meeting minutes or what you're doing. We'll talk about this a little more in a second, but make sure that as you're recording what you're doing, whether it's in meeting minutes or notes that you take as part of your review process, when you're making decisions, make sure that somewhere in there you're documenting how this decision, how this action, in your opinion, at the time, was in the best interest of the plan participants. That's what people are looking for, is to make sure that you've got that tie. The next thing is to carry out their duties prudently. Now, people have probably heard of the prudent man rule, which is, you would have done what another person in a similar circumstance would have done at that point in time. In ERISA, which is the body of laws that govern 401ks and our fiduciary responsibilities, is they kind of ramp it up just a notch, and they actually say they want you to use what's called the prudent expert rule, which means you would do what somebody else with knowledge of those matters would have done. And I'm sure everybody follows famous 401k cases and little quotes that come from it, but one in the early 80s that came out was a full heart and an empty head does not make a good fiduciary. So that's kind of where that prudent expert concept came from. Is, again, it's one thing to say, hey, we did the best we could, but really what they want you to do from a DOL standpoint is have that expertise available to you. Follow documents. Number 3, that one's pretty self-explanatory, but unfortunately, you don't see people getting sued for that, but that's where we actually see a lot of people run into problems with the Department of Labor, the IRS. Diversified plan investments. A lot of attention is paid to that. I mean, if you think about, if you have an hour or you spend 90 minutes in a review meeting talking about your 401k plan, what percentage do people spend talking about plan investments? Any guesses? Anybody want to? More than 75%? Okay, more than 50%? Everybody good? So if I'm off base, let me know. But what we see pretty consistently, and this is also something the plaintiff's attorneys see, is like, hey, people have they spend the vast majority of their time analyzing all these investments, but they're really not taking and tying a lot of the other concepts together. So yeah, it's great that you're analyzing your investments, but there's also more to it, which is monitoring service providers and also paying only reasonable and necessary plan expenses. Now, these are where some things get a little bit nebulous. What does it mean to monitor a service provider, and what is paying only reasonable plan expenses? Again, very gray areas. Largely intangible. This was done on purpose. The Department of Labor is not trying to dictate to you how you need to run your plan or what service providers you need to use, or that you have to have the lowest cost provider out there. But what they do want to see, and what the attorneys will want to see as well, is something within your documentation that says, well, we know what we're paying. We've reviewed those fees. We've made a determination that the services we're getting and the fees we're paying, there's value, it's reasonable for a plan of our size, with our buying power, with our cost structure, maybe based on assets or headcount, whatever it is. But that's kind of the key here, and that blends also into the monitoring of service providers. The other thing that's important is when it comes to fees, they're really the most concerned with any fees you're paying out of your plan assets, okay? If you're getting billed for whatever it is, I'm not going to pick on anybody, but if a service provider is overcharging you and you're paying that out of your corporate treasury, they could care less. If you're paying too much for something out of your plan, investment expense ratios, advisor fees, record keeping fees, whatever it is, that's really where all of this kind of gets ratcheted up, and that's where all of these kind of fiduciary responsibilities around fees come in, is when the participants are the one bearing the cost or bearing the burden of those expenses. So I covered that really fast. Sometimes we spend 45 minutes to an hour talking about those things, so I did that in hopefully less than 5. Any questions on some of those broad concepts? Because I think that's important just to make sure that you guys understand that at a high level. Sure, that's not the first time people are seeing it, but questions, concerns? All right. The next one, and this is where we'll get into some more kind of tactical things here. Lack of process. That's one of the big things that we see in complaints, and as we see from ERISA attorneys, is just there's just not a good process that the plan fiduciaries, that the employer has gone through. So some of the phrases that are out there is, your process is your protection. Use procedural prudence, check the box on, whatever checklist you have, kind of documenting fiduciary responsibilities might be. But it is important to have a process, and it also is important that that process is something that makes sense, and it's a process that actually gets you to a point where you can say, yes, we've made these decisions in the best interest of our plan participants, and also that you kind of go through a few of these other things. To the extent that you're making decisions, record those decisions. One thing that came out of a case a few years ago was even the fact that you're not making a decision, that actually is a decision when it comes to something from a fiduciary perspective. So you go out and you do a market search. You get a bunch of proposals from different providers. That's all in your minutes, but then there's nothing that says you did anything with those. So what does that mean? What does that say about your process? What decisions did you make as a fiduciary? Well, somebody coming in from the outside is going to say, well, they went through this, but it kind of looks like their decision was we're going to keep the status quo, and status quo is not great. So it's awesome that you had a process that you went through, but your decision wasn't, the way you recorded your decision or the outcome of that didn't leave you in a good spot. We've talked about determining decisions based on your participants' best interest, and a lot of conversation goes into notes. So everyone to the extent that you have meetings and you're getting together to discuss things about your retirement plan, are people taking minutes or having some type of memorialization of what you've talked about and has come from that? Usually you guys are asking for those things. Okay, so one of the questions we get a lot is, all right, well, how much detail do we need to go into in these minutes? How much detail do we need to provide? Really, what we tend to guide people towards, and what we've heard most people want to see is, if you had to answer a question based on something you did 3 to 5 years ago, you need enough detail in the minutes that you'd be able to kind of recollect the process that you went through to get to that decision. But you don't need to say, well, this person said this and that person said this, and then we had this real long conversation about this. It's, for example, let's just use the service provider search as an example. We conducted an RFP. Here's the criteria that we went through. Here's the process that we went through. Here's the decision that we made. Here's why we felt this was in the best interest of our plan participants. Here's the timeline in terms of when we're going to have a new provider in place. Those are things that are very important to have, and to have enough detail, again, that you'd be able to recollect that if you are having to talk to an attorney, if you're having to talk to a DOL auditor, as an example, or someone from the IRS. But that's really, again, what you want to be thinking about. The other thing is, yes.
Just a question. How often do you think we should be having these meetings?
Really good question. So what we see is that really depends on, in reality, it depends on plan complexity. I think for all plans, at a minimum, you'd want to get together at least once a year. That's regardless of size. I think as plans grow in size or complexity, then what we typically see is the decision comes to semi-annual versus quarterly. We have some clients that are, they get together semi-annually just because there's not enough things in their opinion that happen to really have a substantive conversation to pull together some top people within the organization. We also have some clients where there's just a lot going on. So for a period of 18 months or 2 years, you're meeting quarterly, and then you kind of get things where you want them to be, and then now you're meeting semi-annually. The only thing I would say that would maybe guide you a little differently on that would be if you have anything in your investment policy statement that says we're supposed to meet this many times a year. If you have a committee charter that spells out, well, our committee does this and we meet 4 times a year. So if there's anything like that, then you need to follow it. But if you're just looking for, hey, we're trying to create a guideline, it really is what you think is best for the participants, and whatever period and frequency will help you continue to be able to say, we're monitoring the plan and we're making decisions in the best interest of our employees.
Is there an expectation depending on the size of the plan versus, let's say, 25 million, 50 million, 75, 100? How many times? I mean, is there recommendations?
I've seen best practices, and when we talk to our clients, certainly over 100 million, we'd recommend quarterly, even if there's not a ton going on. It is just, that like kind of 100 million to 500 million in assets is where we kind of see the next level of fiduciary lawsuits potentially coming. Right now, if you're not at a $500 million, $500 million or up, you're really not on the radar screen of most of the litigation firms. Now, there could be something really weird, and there's a handful of cases out there of plans that are $25 million, $15 million, but those are more one-offs that kind of had some exceptional situations. But where you see true interest from the plaintiff's attorneys are, that $500 million and up. It used to be $1 billion, now it's down to $500 million. And I've actually got a conversation that I'm doing with an attorney next week, a plaintiff's attorney, and we were prepping for that. And he's like, yeah, 100 to 500 million is the next, as people continue to look for more targets on the employer side, that's kind of the next spot. I think under 100 million, I would really gauge it by what's going on. Are you just starting a new committee? Do you have a lot of things that you're working on? Are you doing an RFP? Are you redesigning your investment lineup? Are you redoing your fee structure? Things like that might require that if you're taking on a lot of things, it might require more frequent meetings, but less than that, semi-annual to quarterly is fairly typical, and it ranges all over the place, but not annual would probably be a little too infrequent at that point. Somebody else had a question? Maybe?
Ask if it has to do with size of staff, but it's more the amount of money, from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think in our world, a lot of it does based on plan assets, because that's a lot of times how people are looking at risk. Because what the lawyers are looking for is to mount a lawsuit, there needs to be enough damages to make it sort of worth, or potential damages to make it worth their while. But I would really come back to, it's just moving parts and complexity. So if there's a lot of things going on, hey, you might have a $10 million plan, but you've got 3,000 employees and you're doing acquisitions, you're having to make decisions about various things that might require you, hey, if we're only meeting once a year, well, it doesn't feel like we have enough time to get people together to digest some of those things that we need to digest. So again, there's not a wrong answer. Like if you meet quarterly and you're a $10 million plan, that's not bad. The only thing I would be concerned about is, are you going to burn some of those people out where it's like, okay, why am I coming to this meeting if we're not really discussing anything new, or we're not making any we're not making any decisions. We're just sort of going through the motions. So that's where I would say you try to find that medium where you've got enough to keep everyone engaged and interested, and you're making decisions, you're being, you feel like you have enough to talk about, versus just, okay, well, I think we should meet quarterly for the sake of, because that gives us better risk management. I don't know that trades off exactly. Okay. So these are actually some bullet points that came out of a recent lawsuit that actually was successfully defended by American Century. So American Century, they're a fairly large plan. They're a little over $500 million in assets. They were sued by not Schlichter, but another plaintiff's attorney. And basically, this is kind of what they came up with as some of the reasons that they were able to successfully ward off the suit that they had to deal with. And again, that suit was for a lot of the same reasons that everyone else was being sued. The only difference with them is they are investment managers. American Century, they have investments that they manage. Some of those investments were in their plan, but the other complaints were, you're using the wrong share classes, you're using active investment management instead of passive. In this case, you had too many investment options, but this is really what they come out with. So we mentioned an investment policy statement. Is everybody kind of good in concept with what that means? Still, one of the things we do get a lot of questions about, well, should we have an investment policy statement? What should that include? And one of the things that they and others are recommending is that, yes, you should have an investment policy statement. It is something actually that the Department of Labor will ask for. It's something that we're finding a lot of auditors are actually asking for as part of their annual review package. But I think the important thing in an investment policy statement, and I agree with this, is it should offer guidelines, not specific directions. So when you think about that investment policy statement, in our opinion, you don't want that so granular that you're forced to take certain actions, or if you don't do something, you're in violation of that investment policy statement. So it's guidelines about how we look at investments. What types of asset classes can we offer? What is the process for placing a fund on a watch list or removing a fund from an investment menu, but not something that says, okay, well, if the fund violates this specific criteria, we must remove it within this number of days. You believe it or not, you still see some of those out there. Meeting minutes, we talked about that. That's pretty important. One of the things that this came out, this is their larger plan, but one step that we do see some committees taking, especially with larger positions in their plans or target date funds, is get on the phone with some of the people that manage these assets and ask questions, have a dialogue. Believe it or not, the companies love to do this. So if you have, target date funds are very, very popular in retirement plans right now. If you have a target date manager that you've got a lot of your assets with and you're not 100% sure how that works or what the strategy or philosophy behind that is, or you're just a little concerned about, hey, well, the market's doing really well right now, but what happens in a bear market? There are so many people that through either yourself or through your advisor or your record keeper, you can get access to these companies and they will talk to you. They will spend time during your committee meeting taking your questions, helping you understand more about the strategy. But that was, again, one of the bullet points that came out of this lawsuit. In terms of things that are discoverable, notes, emails, instant messages, all of that stuff from a process standpoint is discoverable. So just, again, keep in mind as you're communicating things that that's an important thing. Electronic files, always, in our opinion, a good practice. Fiduciary training, as Lisa mentioned, this is one thing we see a lot of employers just don't quite go through the process to kind of keep themselves current about what's going on. Again, regularly scheduled committee meetings, there's no prescription out there in terms of what's enough. I think the only thing that most people would agree upon is you got to do one a year. But other than that, I don't think there's anything that you could say, every single time this is the way you do it. Again, we talked about the prudent expert thing. So if you don't have the expertise, find it. And then their last point really mimics what we've talked about as well, which is act in the best interest of plan participants.
Record retention, how long do we need to keep these documents?
Statute of limitations is 6 years. So what we typically see is kind of 6 to 7 is what people generally recommend. That's for fiduciary stuff. That a signed plan document, any type of IRS correspondence or DOL correspondence, that usually you want to hang on to for longer. But from a fiduciary standpoint, 6 to 7 years is typically what we see most of the attorneys and other people tell you in terms of how long you'd want to hang on to, like meeting minutes or investment reviews, fee benchmarking, RFPs, things like that. Okay, we're going to move on to plan economics. This is where things people have still get a little tripped up. So plan economics, plan fees, there's a lot that's changed. So if anybody's been kind of managing 401ks for a while, 5, 10, 20 years ago, don't worry about fees. It's all in there. Everybody's kind of getting what they need. Then sort of the market changed to, well, what's in there? How does this work? And now basically where we are in the market and from a best practice standpoint is, we want to see the ingredients. We want to know what each ingredient is, how much it costs, what it does. So it's been a big change over the last several years. A lot of that has been driven by ERISA litigation. So despite some of the things that the DOL tried to do with fee disclosure, that made a good stab at trying to get employers to take a little bit better look at what's going on with their fees and have better understanding. But I think the bigger thing that's impacted a lot of the fee side of it has been the litigation. The other thing that's going on out there is over the last 10 years, the retirement industry has been changing very, very quickly. There's a lot of stuff going on right now that I could spend a long time talking about, and I would unfortunately leave Lisa with no time, which we can't do. So, but industry competition is also driving a lot of the conversation on fees right now. Not only is it driving fees lower, but it's also driving how people are communicating about fees, how people are talking about fees, and some of the ways that they're either disclosed or considered. So a lot of people kind of ask, all right, well, I hear you. We need to take a look at our fees. Well, what does that mean? How do we do that? We get a report, we get something from our providers that tells us what we're paying, but how do we know if what we're paying is right? How do we, from a fiduciary standpoint, how do we make sure that those are necessary and reasonable? Really what we see from an evaluation standpoint is 3 different ways. Doing a benchmarking, getting quotes, and doing an RFP. So those are three very different things. Now, benchmarking, what I will say, I think is a very effective way to kind of get yourself, to make sure you're in sort of the right zip code on fees and that you're not paying an exorbitantly too much based on a plan of your size, head count, average account balances, things like that. But the plaintiff's attorneys do not think benchmarking is really worth its weight in salt. So if your only review that you've done of your fees is, well, hey, 3 years ago we did a benchmarking survey, I don't know that that really is going to hold off a class action lawsuit. What the plaintiff's attorneys want to see is they want to see an RFP. So what they want is not just, well, hey, how does our plan compare to other plans of our size? And okay, yeah, it seems like we're in the 50th percentile, so that's all good. What they really want to see is that you've gone out to market and asked specifically for, here's our details, here's the services we want, here's what we don't want, etc. What is the cost to run our plan? That's really what they want to see. Now, is that feasible for every company to do? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. How often should you do that? Well, the kind of the theme that we see in the industry is RFP every three. That came from, so RFP every 3 years. That actually came from, and it wasn't a ruling, it wasn't a judge saying that, it was actually just the opinion of an expert witness in one of the cases saying that it seems reasonable that people should do an RFP every 3 years. But again, coming back to some of the other questions like how many times should we meet, there's no written statute that says you have to do it in any level of frequency. But certainly I think the industry has come around to say, well, if you're looking for something, 3 to 5 years is kind of a good timeline in terms of if you haven't done an RFP, that's a good thing to keep in the back of your head. The middle of the one there, quotes, or maybe what some would call an RFI, is that's kind of one step up from benchmarking where it's like, all right, I don't know that we want to make a change, but let's at least go get a couple other quotes for advisory or record keeping or TPA or whatever services. That helps, but it's not quite as specific or quite as in-depth as an RFP. And again, with this, the goal here is not that you need to get to the lowest cost provider. The goal is that you're able to say confidently that the fees that we're paying and the services we're receiving are necessary and reasonable and in the best interest of our plan participants. The other thing that's really emerging in the fee world is how fees are calculated and allocated. So this has become a very interesting conversation and something that a lot of plan sponsors still struggle with. So to the extent that people understand how fees are being paid or what they're paying, once you get into the, like, what's actually driving that, how are they being calculated, and then how is it being spread out or allocated to our plan, going into some of this, and all right, well, is it per head? Is it pro rata, meaning people are getting an equal percentage of their account? Is it some combination of both? But the long story short here is what you should be in a position to do. Like if you want to have, say, all right, are we being good fiduciaries? You should be able to have some ability to communicate to someone else, the Department of Labor, a participant, an attorney, for example, exactly how your fees work. And that's really important. The other thing that's really changed over the last several years is this idea of revenue sharing. So again, coming back to our pie analogy there, well, it's kind of all in there. Well, one of the reasons it was all in there is because a lot of the funds all had some type of revenue sharing arrangement which was being used to pay the costs of the plan. So that's perfectly fine, it's perfectly legitimate, but what you need to be able to do is understand how that works. So one thing where this has really come up is in some of the class action lawsuits that are out there, one of the big complaints is, well, you're using retail share classes, you should be using institutional share classes. What that means is that most investments have many different types of fee structures. People heard A shares or R shares or Z shares or I shares. So it's all the same investment, but it's just they have a very different expense structure to it. Some might be a little higher, some a little lower, and really what it is it's just how much money is being allocated to revenue sharing or 12B1 fees or some other type of fee rebate or other way that providers are getting paid or getting compensated. So from a lawsuit standpoint, that's where some of the other litigation has come from. One of the SoCal Edison case here in California that went all the way to the Supreme Court, one of the biggest complaints within that was, hey, you've got $800 million or so in this investment that I could buy in my IRA with a $2,000, balance. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And the committee had no notes, they had no process, they had no deliberation that they looked for a less expensive share class that might be in the best interest of their plan participants. So when you think about it, if your plan is going to be paying for those plan expenses and using revenue sharing, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that you understand how it works, make sure that you're evaluating your share classes. And one of the other things that we're starting to see is this idea of fee socialization. So over the years, when we've seen a lot of these investment menus that have been driven by revenue sharing, well, as investment menu design has changed a little bit, you're seeing some of this revenue sharing amounts be very different amongst different types of funds. So how many people offer index funds in their retirement plan? Okay, most index funds have no revenue sharing to them. How many people offer target date funds in their retirement plans? All right, a lot of target date funds have revenue sharing in them. International funds tend to have higher revenue sharing than domestic funds. Small cap funds a lot of times have higher revenue sharing than large cap funds. So when you think about it, if we've seen this with a lot of employers, and again, this isn't wrong, it's just kind of where the next, the next iteration of this whole fee conversation is going is, all right, well, let's say we've got 3 people on the committee who they're all using index funds, but we're defaulting all of our participants into these target date funds that have a lot of revenue sharing in them. Is that right? Might not be wrong, but does it feel good that you have a lot of your employees through this default process paying a lot more of your plan fees than maybe some of the more sophisticated folks in your plan who are choosing index funds and paying no plan fees because there's no revenue sharing, there's no expense being added on to those. So this is where this whole idea of fee socialization is emerging into the market. So you'll hear that as a fee levelization, offering debits and credits for some of the different revenue sharing or 12B1s or sub-TA fees. But the idea here is, and again, this isn't law, this is just kind of what we're seeing emerge as a best practice, is you can get to a point where you can say, regardless of what investment you've chosen, yes, the investment expense ratios might be different, but you're paying a similar amount in plan costs, whether you're doing that on a per head basis or whether you're doing that on a pro rata basis. Again, that's kind of where we're headed. We're not quite there yet. The other thing, and this is starting to come into litigation, is this idea of proprietary funds or other ways that providers can make money. So the biggest culprits here are, and culprits is the wrong word, but the biggest area where we see a lot of people gaining, proprietary funds is in target date funds. Target date funds, in my opinion, are wonderful investments. They do some really good things for a lot of people, but they're also a big battleground right now in the service provider community. So as you are evaluating fund options or you're evaluating different provider options, people are really battling for those target date funds because one of the things that happens when you make changes is people are tending to do sort of these default conversions where a lot of money ends up in these target date strategies. So, hey, is it wrong to use a proprietary target date fund? Absolutely not. But if you're going to go down this path, whether it's target date or stable value or index, you need to make sure that you're able to justify that those funds are in the best interest of your plan participants, not just got you some great deal on plan fees or whatever the case is. Because there's some great target date fund managers that might not have the best strategy or allocation for your group, but they're sometimes tied to some groups that can offer some very, very low fees. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing that comes up a lot is self-directed brokerage. So if you offer an option within your plan, maybe you have 20 or 15 or 30, whatever the number is, core investment options, but you also have a self-directed brokerage account. That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but what's your process to evaluate that? How are you evaluating the fees that are part of the self-directed brokerage? How are you monitoring what's going on in that self-directed brokerage? There's a lot of conversation about that, but that is kind of an emerging area of litigation. Not that it's wrong to do it, but you can't just turn a blind eye and say, well, that's just that's their stuff. It's not it's not related to the plan. Well, yeah, it is. It's still a plan asset. You still have some fiduciary responsibility to it. And then the other thing we're seeing come out is the automatic IRAs. So if someone leaves your company and they have a balance between 1,000 and 5,000, how many people move them into an IRA automatically if they don't respond to notices or things like that? Okay, a couple hands. I would imagine, whether you realize it or not, I would imagine a lot of your plans have a provision that say if you have a small balance, after a certain period of time, that person is going to be moved into an IRA. We're seeing plaintiffs' attorneys, and we're seeing a lot of defense attorneys as well, really trying to get proactive with their clients and say, do you understand how that process works? Who is that provider? Are you going from ABC provider in the 401k to their ABC IRA? What do those fees look like? What are the investments that they have the option to choose or they're being defaulted into? And again, not wrong answers, just something to be aware of and to tick and tie from a fiduciary standpoint. The other thing that's starting to emerge in lawsuits and this is something Jerry, I think, is really trying to figure out how to crack the nut on this whole idea of participant services. So one of the things that kind of goes on in a reality in 401k providers is you've got some really good 401k providers that do a lot of great things for employees. And as the world is kind of coming together and a lot of services and different things are sort of being pushed together, one of the reasons that a lot of people are in the 401k business, and whether it's record keepers, advisors, TPAs, whoever it might be, they want those rollovers. So when a participant leaves and they have $300,000 in their 401k plan, they know they've got a pretty darn good chance of getting that if they're already a known entity. They want wealth management. They want managed accounts, which is another concept here. But those participant services, if you talk to some of the plaintiffs' attorneys, they feel there's an economic value to that, right? One of the things that Jerry said multiple times to me is, Rick, how much do people spend on a Super Bowl ad to get 30 seconds of someone's attention? Millions. So how is it that you can have a provider that spends years marketing for free to these participants of a 401k plan and get no economic value from that? The participant or the plan sponsor gets no economic value for that. Now, again, we're starting to see some people try to chip away at that. We haven't seen anybody get nailed for it yet, but that is one of the things that some plan sponsors now are trying to figure out. It's like, okay, I get it. Yes, you're in the rollover business. Yes, we don't want our participants just left with no solution. But how does that benefit our plan? How does that benefit our participants? And are we comfortable with the processes and the practices that are being used there? All right, I'm going to move quickly to try to cover the last couple ones. Any questions on fees? I kind of moved fast on fees. Any questions or anything we didn't talk about on fees? The one last thing on fees that I'll just talk about, sorry, one other thought. As fees have been coming down, whether it's investment management or record keeping fees, what we're starting to see are other types of fees creep up. So just, again, not bad, but just something to be aware of. The trend that we've been seeing more often than not now is, okay, well, we'll lower this fee, but we didn't used to charge for distributions. Now we're going to charge $50 for distributions. We used to charge $25 for loans. Now we're going to charge $100 for loans. We used to not charge for this or that. Now we're going to. So what we're starting to see, and one of the analogies that I've made is the 401k world is starting to kind of go the way of the airlines, where you used to be able to buy a ticket and you could check your bags, you could board when you wanted to board and all that stuff. Now you buy a ticket and that's only half the battle. If you want to check your bag, you got to pay extra. You want to board the plane early, you want to pay extra. You want to use the overhead bin, you got to pay extra. You want to sit in a specific area of the plane, you got to pay extra. So that's kind of the way the 401k world's going right now, is that those headline costs, the record keeping costs, the investment costs, as those go down, some of these others are creeping up. So again, not bad, just something to be aware of. And also, as you're evaluating providers, make sure you kind of take that extra step to look at that, because that is an area where people are starting to see some differentiation. So we talked about this whole concept of the prudent expert, right? So under ERISA, managing 401k plans, lack of expertise is one of the things that people kind of get caught up with. It's like, well, hey, how are we supposed to know? Or hey, so what we see a lot of defense attorneys and a lot of the plaintiffs' attorneys are saying is, it's your duty to seek out this expertise if you don't feel like you have it. There's two broad categories of experts. This is my opinion. You have experts serving as fiduciaries, and then you have experts that are not serving as fiduciaries, and I think it's important to understand the difference, and we'll kind of move through this. So the first two kind of relate to investments. So you can hire consultants and advisor. They can serve as fiduciaries, not all do, but they can serve as a fiduciary and help you with your duties to oversee, select, and monitor investments. This gets a little confusing sometimes, but a 321 fiduciary is someone providing you with investment advice. Hey, I think you should buy this fund. Okay, great, we'll do that. You're now serving as a fiduciary based on the investment advice they provided you. A 338 fiduciary is someone that is taking on discretionary authority, meaning that they are managing the investments for you in your plan. Okay, both carry fiduciary responsibility. Some will argue that 321 does not have as much as fiduciary oversight as 338. In the end, here's the way it works: you're going to get sued anyways. So it's not like if you hire a 338, you won't get sued, versus if you hire 321, you will. You're going to get sued regardless. It's just a 338. You might have a little better success saying that they were the ones who were making the investment decisions. Right. The other thing that we're seeing that's kind of popping up here a little bit is the concept of a 316 fiduciary. This is a service that usually a third-party administrator or a record keeper would provide, where they actually serve as a fiduciary relating to plan administration. So they'll sign your 5500. They would take on the fiduciary responsibility for approving loans and distributions. Keep in mind here, not all are created equal. So there's a lot of different service models in that world. Experts that aren't fiduciaries, but again, just because they're not fiduciaries doesn't mean they're bad. ERISA attorneys, believe it or not, an ERISA attorney is not a fiduciary. So they're very helpful, but they're not serving in a fiduciary capacity to your plan. Legal advice is a fantastic thing. Attorney-client privilege is a fantastic thing. And one thing I would say is that if you're a plan of any size, and I'll come back to your thing. I mean, if you have $20 million, $50 million, $100 million or more in your plan, you should have an ERISA attorney in your Rolodex, in my opinion. That doesn't mean they have to come to every meeting. That doesn't mean you need an annual retainer with them, but you should know an ERISA attorney and have someone that you're familiar with. And what we see is, yes, some clients, larger clients, they have ERISA attorneys that are very active. They're talking to them on a monthly or weekly basis even. But we have other clients that are just, hey, we know them, they know us. We can call them, they can do projects for us, we can ask them questions, we can get advice as needed. But I'd really recommend, just with as complex as things are these days, if you have a plan of any consequence or size, just to have someone at least in your Rolodex. Plan auditors, great resource. I mean, plan financials, oversight, operating controls. I will tell you that what will get the attention of a CFO is something in your audit report on your 401k that's listed as deficient. So having a good auditor, and I will say, we see a lot of auditors out there, and not everyone applies an equal amount of rigor. I think there's some auditors that are sort of doing the bare bones minimums. I think there's some auditors that are assigning very junior people to review your plans. And I think sometimes, while there might be a lot of questions that auditors have or a lot of things they want to know about process, they're really there to help you. They're really there looking over your shoulder, and you would much rather have a conversation with them about something that's going wrong in your plan than somebody else. So just kind of always keep that in mind. Third-party administrators, I think TPAs are a fantastic resource. I know over the years there's been a lot of conversation about, well, hey, are we big enough to go bundled now? We get that question all the time. And I think with a good third-party administrator, you have an excellent hands-on resource for administration, compliance, consulting. The 401k business model is changing so quickly right now. So the service that is being applied to especially smaller plans is just getting put in the hands of people with less experience, less tenure. Just almost every year, it kind of goes up market by millions of dollars what you need to actually get good service and good support. So I think the role of a third-party administrator, I think, is something that's really, really important. If you have a plan that has any complexity to it, or you feel like you need some more consistency, I think that's something that makes a lot of sense. Record keeping, again, the theme here is none of these are fiduciaries. Record keepers also are not fiduciaries, but are a great resource for a lot of things, employee education, but also if you're using them on a bundled basis, plan administration, compliance. So whether it's the first page or this page, make sure that you're asking questions, you're engaging your experts. What are other plans like ours doing? How can we make our plan better? What are things we're not talking about that we should be talking about? All of these things are things that I think really make a big difference in terms of making sure that you're running a successful plan, staying compliant, keeping up with best practices, etc. Last thing, and just mistakes to avoid, fiduciary liability insurance. It is a very inexpensive policy to buy. It has a lot of benefit. If you are, heaven forbid you are sued, to provide that protection for for defense counsel, to help with, settlement costs. It's not required by law, but again, remember, a fiduciary liability insurance is not an ERISA bond. So an ERISA bond, you have to have that as part of your 5,500. A fiduciary liability insurance is completely different. One of the things that, hey, how much should we have? Well, again, that really is actually going to depend on your plan size. And there's some charts and things that if anybody has questions, I'm happy to share. But yeah, that is one of the last things, is just, again, you don't have to have it, but it's very inexpensive and provides a good peace of mind. So, Lisa, I'm out of time. These are my bonus slides. So I don't know, is there anything you want me to forward to here?
Oh, there we are.
There you are.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really great presentation. Thank you, Rick. We've come up with a little 401k prep checklist, which you guys should have. It's a two-sided blue sheet. It's the same information on the slides as up here, just looks different. This checklist is good for people that are going through an audit for the first time. I know many of you in the room have been through an audit, but this is probably a good tool to use if you're trying to get somebody else involved in the audit. Maybe you get a little help in the prep. So this is a good tool for that. So I'm just going to talk through some of the items that we typically request for an audit. The first one is getting us online access to the record keeper platform. One thing that's great about plan audits now is a lot of the reporting and the sample requests are items that are stored with the record keeper. So if we get the auditor access, we can go in there and download all those reports. A vast majority of it, we can make sample selections and request things like checks, distribution request forms, that type of thing directly from the record keeper. So all without bothering you, which is good. I know you guys have plenty to do besides the audit. So getting us the auditor access is really important. We'll also be able to access your draft 5500, your discrimination testing usually. So that's the big thing to get started with prepping for an audit. When we go out to do an audit, we're basically testing to know that you're following your plan document. So the plan document is outlining what is specific to your plan. So we like to gather in advance the plan document, the adoption agreement, and the summary plan description, and we kind of go through that and understand what terms apply to your plan so that we can test to that. So getting that in advance of the audit is really important so we can start with good knowledge of your plan. As part of the audit process, we also test distribution payments and loans. Again, a lot of this information will come from your record keeper. So we fill out an auditor request form, we send it to your record keeper, they give us that information. Depending on how your service agreement is set up, sometimes certain documents are kept at the company. So a good example of that is sometimes the employer will keep a copy of support for a hardship distribution or a loan that's over 5 years. So if that's documentation that you keep at the employer, know that we're going to ask for that and look at that when we're on site. We also want to review employee files, especially with distribution payments. This is when money is actually leaving the plan, so we want to know that it's going to a real employee. A lot of times when we come out, clients will want to give us like a download from the payroll report that has like the birthday, the date of termination. We don't really want to go with that because technically that is information that's just been manually input by somebody operating payroll. We'd rather see the employee write, oh, this is my birthday, this is my social. And that way we know that that date is right, the social is right, it's right in the sense it's right with the record keeper. So a lot of times this stuff is off-site. The employee files can be quite old. We do want you to pull it, and we're happy to give you any selections well in advance so you have time to do that. Another key piece is the census. The census has a listing of all employees that receive payment during the year. It should include employees that are participating in the plan and those that are not just only those that are contributing. There's some steps you guys can take to make sure that the census provided is right. You should be tying out the wages to your payroll register for the company. Also tying out the employee contributions and the employer contribution if it's run through payroll to make sure those all tick and tie. And then also tracing it into the plan. So making sure if $100,000 was withheld from the plan, it's deposited with Fidelity or whoever your record keeper is. So if you take those extra steps to make sure that all ticks and ties, we won't send it back to you and say, no, this doesn't tie. There can be a lot of back and forth in the beginning. So those are good best practices to make sure you're reconciling those numbers. Any questions thus far? Just like a regular corporate audit, we also do risk assessment for the plan. So we're looking at key plan processes. Payroll is a big part of plan operations. So we're going to look at how you add new employees to the system, what kind of paperwork you get for a termination, who has access to payroll, and then we'll also ask about how are participants notified that they're eligible, what's your process for approving distributions, that type of thing. So at Wines, we use like a questionnaire where we just ask all different questions about those processes. But you could also keep your own internal documentation. It's a good idea to have good understanding of how all those processes work in case you have internal turnover. We'll also check your fiduciary processes as well. So we are going to ask for any minutes for your plan committee. We're going to ask if you're reviewing your SOC 1 for your payroll provider and your record keeper. And then we'll also make sure that you're getting all your required communications out. A couple extra notes at the bottom. If you are a small plan and this is your first year going through an audit, we do have to look 2 years back. So it can be extra painful the first year because you're going through a new process and then we have to gather extra information. And it can be a little more time consuming to get those reports, especially if you've changed record keeper in the last 2 years. So heads up, if that is going to be the position you're in, you'll want to get after tracking down those reports early. And the last items are kind of the things we see over and over, especially with initial audits. So our top findings, top management letter comments we give. You want to make sure that you're reviewing your definition of plan compensation and making sure that your payroll settings match. So if your plan document says all gross wages are plan compensation, you don't want to have your payroll settings to not be deferring on bonus or not be deferring on commission checks. So make sure that those are in alignment. The good thing is once you set it and you have it right, it's going to continue to process consistently and accurately. Another big thing is if you do a plan amendment to change plan compensation, you want to tell the people in payroll, because we've seen a couple times where a change is made at the plan committee level, nobody tells payroll, they don't make the changes, and then you're out of compliance. Of course, timely remittance of participant deferrals. The main thing with this is establishing a consistent pattern. The Department of Labor is not going to come out and say 3 days is the amount of time that it should take. So you want to schedule out your pay date versus when it's uploaded at the trust, and you want to see a pattern. So if you know it's really hard for you to get it transmitted to the record keeper in 1 day, it's better to just do it in 2 days and always do it in 2 days so that you're not demonstrating you could do it faster, but you're not. So we kind of look at the pattern on that. And then you always want to make sure that you have a backup person to remit those funds. So a lot of times we'll see, 2 days, 7, and we'll ask and they'll say, oh, the payroll person was sick, so they didn't get sent. So you want to have somebody cross-train on that so that you don't change your pattern. And then last, you want to make sure that you're following your plan document payment on benefit payments. A lot of plan documents have a force out provision. So certain account balances under a threshold have to get kicked out of the plan. So there's been increased activity where they're seeing that some administrators are not making sure that money is coming out. And if it's a provision of your plan document and you don't do it, you're actually violating your plan document. And then again, you want to monitor lost participants and make an effort to track participants down. So if you owe a participant money, but you don't have their address, you have no way to contact them, you can't just not look for them. There's certain steps you have to follow to track them down. There's also companies that can help you do that as well. Okay, and then one last thing. There is new accounting guidance coming out that's specific to ERISA plans, SAS 136. It's a reporting requirement change. I read through it. I don't think that for our clients it's going to feel like a big change in the audit process. One thing that is going to change is we're no longer going to have a limited scope audit. It's not going to be, it's instead of being called a limited scope audit, it's going to be called the ERISA section 103A3C, which just rolls off the tongue. But that's an opinion that will be specific for ERISA plans only. So that's how we will refer to a limited scope audit going forward. The auditor's report is going to be longer. They're going to put the opinion on page 1 at the top instead of on the second page. And then they're going to require us to get certain representations from you on the onset of the audit. So they just want to make sure that management understands their role in the plan financial reporting and audit process. So we're going to ask you to confirm to us that your plan document is current, that you know you are responsible for plan compliance, that contributions and distributions are processed in accordance with the plan document. So we'll ask you to represent that to us at the beginning of the audit, again at the end of the audit. And there's a certain couple other things, like you'll have to give us the draft 5500 before we issue, but again, we've always requested that anyways. So this is effective for calendar year plans, December 2020. So a couple years out, and then I will have a solutions article coming out to explain that in more detail going forward. Thank you everybody for coming. And then make sure you get parking from Carolyn at the end. Back.
Thank you. And one thing I forgot to say is that all the stuff that Lisa talked about is stuff that you're probably more likely to have issues with than getting sued. So I would say the fiduciary stuff is super, super important, but in terms of the bigger risk is a DOL issue or correction or IRS issue or correction. So details are important. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, but thank you.